producing rosé, and then we're going to focus in on a couple of key regions from specifically Provence, because Provence and Languedoc, that's what's driving the trends here. As we can see, the sales trends, even despite COVID and the tariff, rosé is continuing its 10+ year growth trend, specifically here in the United States. And the key to capitalizing on this trend is really understanding Southern France and specifically Provence, because that's where the premiumization of this category is going. Both of these areas have seen 20+ years of double-digit growth. And Provence, specifically Provence sales alone here in the United States have topped over 2 million cases in 2020. So it's important to know, the other aspect about rosé, it's not one specific demographic that's driving it, although certainly millennials are leading. There is growth in every age demographic and gender demographic that is there. It is really all across the board. And the rosé is more than just a summer drink. It's become a nearly year-round drink, as people in the northerly climates anyways tend to be drinking it in early spring through the summer and into the holiday months. Here in Florida, rosé is a year-round drink. It's something people are drinking all year long. So besides France, which is where we should be focused, but you definitely want to keep an eye on what's going on in California, because that's probably the next hottest market for rosé, followed up by Spain and Italy as well. So those are all places for you to look at to expand our rosé market. Okay, so there's some things on the trends. Just a quick overview on the history of rosé. This may be a new drink, or we kind of view it as a new drink, but it's really pretty much one of the original wines that were ever drunk. I mean, the original fermentation, there's documentation from archaeologists that show that red and white grapes were often co-fermented to make a lighter rosé or a darker red wine. It was actually seen as more pleasant. Wine was back then in ancient times was considered more enjoyable when you co-fermented the red and the white grapes, because that co-fermentation led to less bitter, more pleasant, more fruitier styles of wine. Okay, rosé really would begin to gain it's the first time it would actually gain its recognition as the drink of the wealth and the leisurely and of summer would come in the 1800s, when the who's who of the rich and famous would spend their summers in the south of France, and they would be drinking rosé. And rosé wines really began to expand in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Unfortunately, we had those thing called phylloxera, and then a couple of world wars and the Great Depression and all that kind of stuff that happened really devastated the whole category. And it wouldn't be until post World War II that rosé would kind of start a comeback, but it wasn't the same rosé that was of the south of France. These rosés were those of the bulk producers of Matus and Lancers and Lambrusco. And then this would actually open the door for California White Zinfandel. And then there was a lot of that style of wine, rosé wine, being sold. But when we talk about quality rosé that people are really drinking today, that category really begins again in around the late 90s, early 2000, and Provence would again begin to deliver, and still today is the benchmark for that particular style, which is why we should first and foremost know Provence and Languedoc, and then from there build our understanding of the rosés from the rest of the world. Okay, Sean, you want to add anything there?
No, good to go on those couple of slides. It was interesting to see the sales demographics for New York being almost as dark as California and Florida, and it brings true the New York AC.
Yeah. Yep. Very good.
Rosé in a bottle.
Yeah. So rosés basically can be produced from any grape variety, but the best grapes for making rosé tend to have lower levels of tannin, higher flavor intensity, and they tend to ripen relatively easy, right? And that ease of ripeness allows them to be picked earlier to maximize more acidity. And this is one of the reasons why Grenache has become one of the grapes of choice for high quality rosé, because it does ripen easy and it's got a lot of flavor even when you pick it a little bit early, okay? So in any event, these, all of these grapes can be used to make really good tasting rosé, but Grenache so far has really been the leader as far as, quality rosé, but don't overlook any of these other wines for making really, really good rosé. And then also, this is just a quick slide to help people realize just how many regions are making quality driven rosé. Kind of went through the world and looked at, and from my experience of tasting many rosés, where are some of the best tasting rosés coming from, and kind of broke it down by country and region. And this is a really good roadmap for if you're a salesperson and you're looking at a wine list or a store shelf and you're looking for a hole, something that could be sold that they may not have. You can take a look at this really quickly and say, oh, you know what, they don't really have anything from Italy, so where should I go in Italy? They don't have anything from Spain. What should I propose from Spain, right? So it just gives you an opportunity to provide sales opportunities to present to our customers to expand their rosé selection and styles that are there. So with that, now that's kind of the big overview. It's kind of look into production, quality, and the decisions that are made from there. Sean, you want to add anything before we jump into this section?
Just to remind everybody that all of these presentations are housed in the b.a.s.e SharePoint website. So if we blew through those slides as you prepare for a rosé presentation, you can go back and reference those grapes and regions. So, we review all this, but you can always go back and review and prepare and then weaponize the knowledge that's being provided in the presentations.
Yep. In fact, good point. I am going to put those SharePoint links right there. They are now in the chat box. So you can go to the chat box, download those links, and get these presentations. Okay. So back to production and quality. All right. So what makes quality rosé? Not just rosé, but quality rosé. I mean, there's a lot of good rosé out there, and good rosé is going to have, moderate alcohol levels around 12.5% alcohol. They're going to be wonderfully perfumey and fresh and fruity with bright acidity, and just a really good drink. And that's a good standard for your, $8 retail rosé. But why spend more? Because more and more money, really, it means more than just basic. We need something that's going to give us something that's interesting. And so we begin to talk about rosé, and we should talk about rosé in the same way we would talk about quality wine. A great rosé is going to be a wine that has distinct varietal character. It's going to be ripe and with intense fruit flavors. The wines, really good tasting rosés are going to be fragrant. They're going to be wines that kind of draw you into the glass and deliver a dry palate with that impression of sweetness, not actual sweetness, but that glycerol textural from really good quality ripe grapes, right? And I think most importantly, really high quality rosé, there's always this tension between the fruit, the acid, that slightly mild tannic grip, and this really rich mid palate with depth of flavor, okay? And the other thing about really good quality rosé is you can decant it, all right? So, some people think, decanting is something for red wines only, but great rosé, even great white wine, the dry extract levels and being stuck in that bottle, that decanting and aeration can really bring out a lot more aromatic quality, especially when we're talking about a wine of much higher quality than just your basic stuff, right? So, and there are a number of rosés on the market that benefit from decanting. In fact, we're going to wrap up with 3 of them at the end of the presentation that I would highly recommend you decant. So that's our understanding of what makes a quality rosé. So when making quality rosé, we need to focus on viticultural practices and winemaking techniques, specifically reductive winemaking techniques that help bring us to our goal, right? So by managing these various elements of viticulture and winemaking, we're going to produce rosés that have maximum amount of flavor, but also a maximum amount of acidity with reduced ABV. Okay, so lots of flavor, lots of acid, lower ABV makes the wines more friendly, more easier to consume, and it also preserves the freshness. It preserves the fragrance and creates balance, and that again, that tension there. So that is what we're looking for. And in the upcoming slides, we're going to talk specifically about some of these viticultural elements and the winemaking elements, specifically the reductive elements here that create the quality here in rosé. So let's begin a little bit with some viticultural decisions, right? So to maximize that freshness, one of the things you're going to hear us talk a lot about here is the reduction of oxygen, or to minimize oxygen while with both the juice and the fermentation. And then we also want to maximize our acidity. And we can do this by picking the fruit at night or chilling the fruit immediately when it gets to the winery. That's going to reduce the oxidative element with the fruit. We can also, instead of picking or using machine to pick berries, we can use whole clusters. And we're going to talk, in fact, on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between machine picking and whole cluster and how it impacts the juice itself. But so that the picking and how it's picked is going to help us reduce oxygen to the unfermented juice. And then also by picking early, we can maximize acidity and produce wines that are also less prone to oxidation, because higher levels of acid slow down that interaction with oxygen. The problem we have with picking early is you can end up with unripe flavors and thin wine. So you don't want to just intentionally pick early. You still want ripe flavors at lower pH levels. And I guess maybe we're picking at lower pH would be a better way, and as opposed to saying we're picking early. And then the other way, though, if you want more flavor, you're going to want a later harvest, but there's problems with picking at later harvest. You're definitely guaranteed greater flavors and greater ripeness, but your pH is going to rise, and the higher your pH, the more prone your wine is to oxidation, and the higher that pH, the lower the acidity and the lack of freshness that you're going to have. So with growers, and believe it or not, picking for rosé is far more difficult than picking for, say, white wine or red wine. There's a very narrow window with growing these grapes where you're trying to find that right balance between pH, acid levels, and flavor in order to make high quality rosé. Picking rosé for inexpensive is not that difficult. But if you want something that's going to actually meet the standards of what we call for quality rosé, you can see it gets a bit more complicated than a regular harvest. Likewise, with viticulture, they got to make the decision. Do they want to machine pick or do they want to hand harvest? Okay, and machine picking for rosé is actually can be very efficient, and it really helps speed up the process. You can pick at night, and you can get the grapes into the winery much faster than you would with hand picking. And this is all very important for maintaining freshness, right? The problem was with machine picking, though, is once the berries are shook off the vine, they are now destemmed, and the juice begins to ooze slowly out of that little pinhole of where the grape was attached to the vine, right? And so you immediately have a problem with the possibility of oxidation and bacteria, which is one of the reasons why you're now seeing a lot of wineries that are making really good quality rosé. They have a press station near the vineyard to limit the amount of travel that those berries have to go in order to get into the winery, because the longer those berries sit and travel and bounce, you begin to get an uncontrolled maceration, which is not what the wineries want. They want to control that maceration time and that oxidation time, right? So this is also why whole cluster is coming back into the picture for a lot of rosé. Now, the problem is picking whole cluster is much more labor intensive, but the berries are still intact to the stem, and it really reduces any kind of oxidation or maceration issues from the point of picking to the point of actual pressing, right? So you end up with less bitterness, less bitter phenolics, and actually more flavor because of that. Okay, and then Sean, you want to add anything to the viticulture before we jump into the winemaking aspect?
Don't have anything for the viticulture. Fielding a couple interesting questions in the chat box, Matt. One asking for differentiation between the words or terms, rosé versus blush, and you may get into that a little later. The blush term, I think, often being used for a little bit larger production, softer style jug wines, if you will.
Yeah, that would be my definition right there. Because I didn't really put it in here, but yeah, blush is just a different word for rosé, but it really has to do more with white Zinfandel than it does with quality rosé. So
yeah, and it's not a legally defined term.
Correct. It's not a legally defined term. So if somebody wants to call their rosé blush, I guess you can. It's just more of a derogatory term, I think, in today's world. So
yeah, most of the time I would say we've seen it in the North American market, and it generally accompanies a larger production, kind of a non-specific regional wine with obvious residual sugar, off dry in style, and very, very soft.
Yep, I would concur with that.
And then everything else would fall under rosé.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, please don't use the word blush on your wine list anymore. That's really an old school term that's no longer being used. So in any event, so moving into some winemaking decisions, and like all winemaking, whether we're talking about rosé, white, or red, the timing of when oxygen is introduced and how much oxygen is introduced is very, very important with all winemaking, but specifically with rosé. Okay. Oxygen needs to be introduced in small amounts somewhere along the line, because especially during fermentation, because it releases trapped flavor precursors in the grape. So these are trapped flavor precursors, or flavors or aromas that are in the grapes that when you eat the berries, you can't taste. It requires fermentation to actually release those, and oxygen helps release them. So with a little bit of oxygen, you're going to get more aromatic complexity, but the more oxygen you add, the less fruity the wine becomes. And also the easier, specifically when you're trying to make rosé, the color becomes a bit more orange, and that oxygen can also lead to the creation of weird vegetal characteristics. I just tasted an orange-looking rosé from 2020, so it wasn't out of date. It was 2020 with this orange quality, and there was some forced oxygen into it, and it kind of tasted like what is it? Sugar snap peas and stewed strawberries. It was a really odd tasting rosé. It wasn't necessarily bad, but it was really an odd tasting rosé. Won't tell you the producer, because it's in our portfolio. So in any event, but pressing and maceration is also important, because how it's done can limit the oxidative effect. In fact, a lot of times pressing and maceration is done very cold, and it's also done in conjunction with nitrogen blankets to prevent any oxygen from hitting the juice. Most winemakers prefer a little bit of oxygen during fermentation and a minimal amount of oxidation or oxygen with fresh juice. Okay. The thing with fermentation, though, fermentation creates heat, and as soon as fermentation begins, the heat is going to go up. And when you get heat in your fermentation, you're going to extract more color and more tannin. And we're going to talk a little bit about heat and cold maceration on the next slides, but I'm trying to get you prepped to understand what that is. All right. And then the other thing that you're seeing a lot of, and you'll see this on a lot of tech sheets, is they'll talk about settling. And with rosés and many white wines, this settling technique is becoming more and more important, because they've realized that if they just press and ferment, they got the solids in the juice, But when they settle, they can actually settle the white wine or the rosé off of the solids, and then they have this very clean juice that they're going to ferment. But it can lack some aromatic complexity, but it'll be very, very fresh and it won't have any astringency. And then when they ferment the juice with the solids is going to be a bit more coarse and bitter, but it's going to have a lot more aromatic flavor. But now the winemaker can say, look, I got my clean juice, I got my solid juice. Do I want to add 2% back, 5% back, 8% back into the blend? And now they can fine tune that wine to have the right palate texture and the right depth of flavor without maybe too much astringency, right? So the settling is it's a great winemaking tool to dial in the wine to get the right texture and the right depth of flavor that you want out of the wine, again, to bring balance, especially with quality rosés. And then some other important winemaking decisions here are the choice of yeast, fermentation temperatures, the type of lees contact, how much lees contact, whether you're going to do in stainless steel, whether you're going to ferment in old oak, whether you're going to ferment in new oak. And each one of these elements bring a different flavor component, or they contribute to a specific textural aspect of the wine. The problem is it's hard to talk about any one of these in isolation because most winemakers don't use them in isolation. Think of quality rosé, especially today, is a blend. So the winemakers are taking different plots of vineyards. They tend to be fermenting them separately. One of them may be fermented at a warmer temperature, one of them slightly cooler, one of them may get more lees, another one, they may use one yeast for one blend and for one lot, and another yeast for a second lot. And what they end up with is this plethora of colors, palette colors, right? So that they're going to go through and taste and then turn around and blend them all back together in order to get that rosé of the highest quality with the greatest aromatic complexity. And it's important for us to be aware of these decisions, especially when we're trying to sell a more premium quality rosé, because selling an $8 bottle of rosé, none of this matters because most of it is just going to be harvested in bulk, fermented, and boom, they got their rosé. But when we're talking about selling a rosé that's going to retail for $30+ a bottle, you can see all of the additional decision-making processes that can go in to make a wine of greater value, greater aromatic complexity, greater depth of flavor, requires the winemaker to use all of these tools at their exposure, okay? And that's what this is really all about, is why should they buy a $30 bottle of rosé versus an $8 bottle of rosé? Sean, you want to add anything?
We had a question from Rob, and I'm trying to get clarity. Primary indicator for a rosé with salmon color. So I think she's asking about if a rosé presents a salmon color, which is you could kind of think of as pink with a yellow or slightly orangish tinge, would be a salmon colored rosé.
Yeah.
Is that a product of always oxygen being somehow exposed in the production, or could it be from grape selection?
It could be a combination of both. And one of the reasons why you don't see that color in a lot of rosés anymore is because a lot of producers are adding food coloring to tint the wine for a more consistent color, right? But certainly that slightly yellow, and you're usually only going to see it in darker colored rosés because maybe there was skin contact or something else. But yeah, that's usually a sign of more oxygen. You won't find that in direct press though, because it's pressed, right? And they're so clear that you rarely see an off color in direct press wines, which is what we're going to talk about now. So yeah, oxygen is probably
I see it in Grenache, Sangio, sometimes Cinsault. So maybe just grapes that are slightly prone to a little bit of anthocyanin breakdown through oxygen.
Yes, because those same grapes, when you look at them as red wines, also have that orangey color. So, and those are the same grapes that are also very sensitive to oxygen exchange. Yeah. So oxygen is the key there.
And interesting, but off topic, and I'm going to chase it down with you. So when you look at often champagne, rosé champagne, you do see some more salmon.
Yeah.
And often that Pinot Noir certainly has gone through some oxygen exposure. So again, that kind of lines up with there's oxygen coming in somewhere. We're seeing it in these examples.
Yep. And they can't, well, I guess some of the dosage, I guess they could blush it the right way.
Yeah, if they wanted to, there's no laws.
They wanted to, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's
One,
right.
one last question was perhaps when we get to the Saugny portion. So carbonic maceration in rosé production.
Yeah, it can be done. The problem with carbonic maceration is you begin fermentation, and so you're going to start extracting a lot of color very, very quickly. It's not that it can't be done, but it's going to be a very short process because carbonic is traditional. When we talk about tradition, I guess I can address it there. But you'll see as soon as fermentation begins and the temperatures go up, you're going to start extracting more and more color. At what point does your rosé cease becoming rosé and it's now just a light red wine? Right.
And,
Yeah.
and the macerations that take place are under such low temperatures that the fermentation wouldn't start.
Right. Correct.
Right.
Yeah. Because the temperature's got to get above 40 degrees before the yeast is going to actually begin to work. And as soon as you hit 45 degrees, you've really dramatically increased the color extraction that you can have.
Yeah.
And carbonic maceration, I thought had to happen at a higher level because it's happening under pressure. And so the temperatures have to be even warmer. I did not believe, I could be wrong on this, but I thought carbonic maceration has to happen at a higher temperature specifically because of the pressure within the berries. It stops until it gets to a certain temperature. So, but that's scientific stuff that we don't need to worry about now.
Right. Either way, it's not going to start under dry ice.
Yes, it's not going to start under dry ice. No. So direct press method. So the direct press method is the most popular method used today, specifically because it really limits the input of oxygen on the unfermented juice, and it gets the fermentation quickly with the least amount of skin contact, right? So it really, winemakers can tweak how much oxygen is going to impact both the unfermented juice and the fermented juice by just simply choosing, are we going to use destemmed fruit, or are we going to use whole cluster fruit? Are we going to use a basket press, or are we going to use a pneumatic press, right? So if you're using whole cluster in a pneumatic press, you've virtually eliminated any opportunity for oxygen to interact. Likewise, if you use destemmed fruit in a basket press, you're probably going to have the most amount of oxygen in your impact here. Okay. Now again, a little bit of oxygen is required for the to release the trap flavor precursors, and not enough oxygen. If it's too reductive, you're going to end up with a very simple, straightforward, fruity wine. So you're always trying to find that yin and the yang as far as how much is the best. Okay, and so it's not uncommon for rosé producers to use a combination of these techniques again, and maybe they have 12 or 15 different lots, and some of them are destemmed, some of them are whole clusters, some of them are basket press, pneumatic press, and then they have their different lots and they bring them all together for their final ferment. Although, well, for the tasting I lined up here, I got one that's specifically direct pressed, one that's 100% Saugny, and then one of them's a combination of both. So you can see the difference between the two. All right, but direct press method is is where you see the lightest in colors and the most fragrant aromatics are what come out of your direct press method. Then we have the more traditional method. So the traditional method versus the modern method of the same thing. And this is where was basically skin contact. So maceration in the traditional form, and this is really the way rosés were made prior to 1960, before we had all the technology available to us. Basically, you would start your production of red wine, just like red wine. You would punch the cap down maybe once, maybe twice, between anywhere from 2 to 30, 40 hours after the fermentation would begin. And then you would drain that juice off the skins and finish the fermentation off the skin. So as the fermentation begins, more heat, and then between the more heat, more punch downs, the more tannin was going to be extracted. And these rosés made in the more traditional way are going to have more of that orange salmon color. They're going to be a bit more savory, a bit more astringent. And if anybody drinks any of the, you know, really old school Taval rosés, this is exactly what you're drinking, is wine in this style. There's a grip and an astringency to these rosés that if you poured it into a, you know, opaque glass and you tasted it, you might think you were actually drinking a light red wine. So the modern version of this method is cold maceration. So you're still macerating, but it's prior to fermentation, so there's no heat. And what they discovered with technology is when you chilled down the fruit and crushed it, you would extract color and you would extract fruit, but you would extract very little, if any, tannin. And so cold maceration was a way, was a reductive way of extracting a lot of fruit and color without any kind of fermentation or tannin, right? So you maximize your fruitiness by utilizing cold maceration. You maximize your savory and tannin component by using the traditional skin contact maceration, okay? And then the Saignée method, which means bleeding, looks very similar to the maceration method as we just discussed, but the big difference is the grapes that were harvested were not intended to make rosé. The grapes that were harvested to make red wine. This is a very important understanding about the Saignée method. So the goal of Saignée is really to increase the quality and the concentration of color and tannin in red wine. Now, this doesn't mean that the secondary wine or the drawn off the Saignée that was produced can't make good rosé, but we have to remember that rosé was not the primary purpose of the Saignée. The primary purpose of that rosé or the Saignée was to make better quality red wine. Now, if you start off with quality grapes to make great red wine, it would stand to that the rosé that's coming off is also going to be very good rosé, right? And typically this method is used with thicker skin grapes like Cabernet or Syrah. Again, they want to make a darker colored red wine, so they're utilizing that. Now, the problem with Saignée is production is limited to red wine production, all right? You typically are only going to draw 10 to 15, maybe 20% of the juice off in Saignée to make your red wine. So your rosé production is limited to whatever you have as far as red wine production. So it's harder to produce a volume of quality Saignée to make rosé wines for the mass market, if that makes sense. Okay, and then a couple of other methods. Co-fermentation. Again, was more of a historical method, but it's being used again more often today, specifically down in Provence. You'll see in a direct press, they're throwing in their white grapes in with their red grapes as they're pressing, and then co-fermenting the juice together, because it's actually illegal everywhere except for Champagne to blend fermented red wine and fermented white wine together to make rosé. That's actually illegal everywhere except in Champagne. But there's a historical reason why white and red grapes were actually put together. So in red wine production, the addition of white grapes is often done for color stabilization, not necessarily for flavor. And with rosé production, the co-fermentation of red and white grapes actually adds softness. It softens the astringency, and it would boost the fragrance and acidity of the rosé that was actually being produced. But today, co-fermentation happens. It's one of the tools that the winemakers now have at their disposal, which brings us to our first flight of wines. And so again, you're going to get this deck, and take this deck out and put this presentation on for your staff or for your customers, so you can taste them on these three wines so they can see how different the rosés are. And I've done this now. I've tasted through a bunch of rosés, and these three to me really stand out as three very distinctive styles of rosé. So you have the Bieler's Sabine Rosé. And every time I look at the price point of this wine and the amount of work that goes into it, I'm actually quite surprised. Okay, so you're talking about a case one $9.50 rosé, where they have multiple plots. So all of the vineyards are harvested or broken down into different plots. They're all harvested completely separately. Many of these vineyards are field blends, and so they're actually harvesting the red and the white grapes together in these individual plots. And then they have all of these small ferments. And they use different, a variety of different yeasts for each different ferment. They use a variety of lees contact for each different ferment. And at the end, they have this range of flavors and styles, about 50 different lots that they will then turn around and go back and blend into their final product. And when you look at the amount of work that they go through to produce this $9.50 rosé, it's like, it just blows my mind, like, wow. And that's one of the reasons why this stuff is so very, very good. And then we have Gerard Bertrand Joy. And this is a great example of what good Saignée can be. This wine is actually harvested to make the Citriglia is the wine that they're trying to make. They bleed off the first 20% of the free run juice that is going to be fermented separately and bottled. And when you taste it, it's a very light colored wine because, again, it's being bled off right away, but yet there's a richness and a volume and a softness and a roundness. The acid level is definitively lower than Sabine, and it's just plump and fat and easy to drink kind of rosé. And you know it's coming from quality juice because they're trying to make Citriglia, right? And it's mostly Grenache with Syrah and Cinsault. And then you have Domaine Huchard, okay? And here they're using both cold maceration and direct press. And the direct press, they take the Grenache and Cinsault and they direct press that, ferment it separately. And then their Syrah and Tiburon is actually cold macerated, fermented separately, which gives you darker colors, more fruit. And then they blend these two back together to make their final wine. And this wine is just, you know, it's got the greatest volume of fruit that just jumps out of the glass at you. It's more tart than what you're going to find with the Bertrand, but not nearly as fragrant and pretty and delicate as the Sabine. And so you got all these wines, all three of them are under $15, and just three, it's like, wow, the quality of three inexpensive wines, but yet they're inexpensive, but yet they're really, really high quality and really define the different styles of rosé that you can actually get out there. Sean, you want to add anything?
Just to remind everyone that these are the wines that we'll be tasting live with our customers during the rosé event June 8th. So if this is something that you're kind of fired up about, that you might want to share with your volume rosé accounts, who might want to capture some of this market, these are the wines, and these are the wines of influence of process, and excited to see the wines of opportunity and upsell.
Yes, and I think some of these are on the monthly category focus as well. So
one more thing, go back one slide, Matt, is this idea of bleeding off, you know, it's a little bit derogatory sometimes when you say it's a Saignée, because there's an implication that the grapes were grown for red wine and it's just a byproduct. There's a little bit of truth in that, but there's also a little bit to be celebrated in this. There's a long history of that rosé, the bleed off. In Italy, it's called Benruspo, and in France, it's what the family would take. They would pull that wine off the bins to create the wine for the family. Or if it was in the Mezzadria in Italy, that was the wine that the farmer would keep to make himself, and he would give the rest of the must to the landholder. So there is this kind of historical precedent for this being a quality wine, a wine to be enjoyed with abandon and family and fun. Yep. So it's not all to kind of dismiss. There is a lot of quality and history built into these Saignée style wines.
Yeah, yes, great point. All right, so let's move into our southern France as we wrap this up. We're just going to highlight a couple of important regions. There's a lot of regions in the south of France now. And these are the areas that are really leading and defining the benchmark of what quality rosé is. And certainly they've been producing rosé longer than just about any other country here, well over 2,600 years of rosé production. And it's got influence from, the Greeks, the Romans, the Spanish, and obviously the French now. Roughly 60% of all the production, all wine produced, 60% of it is actually rosé. So this is rosé country. That's what they make, right? And they got the perfect climate, the Mediterranean climate, with a great amount of sunlight hours, very little rain. You got the Mistral wind that blows through Provence, and the Terramonte that blows through Languedoc that helps a little bit with dehydration, which allows them to actually pick earlier, again, because that dehydration is going to concentrate and maintain higher levels of acid and concentrate flavors, right? And there's a wide variety of soils down here, but there's a lot of limestone and crystalline, which really help elevate, acid levels or maintain higher levels of acid in this warmer growing area. So it's a great area to grow grapes to make rosé. In this map, you can see there's a lot of regions here that you're going to find on wine bottles down from this area. There's the three large areas of Côte de Provence, and the Côte de Provence now actually has 5 sub-regions that you can find on labels. The Aix-en-Provence, another large area, and then Côte de Lebeau. Those tend to be the 3 bigger areas, and then you have a whole bunch of smaller areas spread throughout here, with Bandol probably being the most prestigious out of all of them. And we're going to talk about Bandol in particular, but I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can easily go to Provence and begin to see just how complicated this region can be. So when we talk about Côte de Provence, you're talking about, and we're talking specifically not about the general area of Provence, but really the AOC of Côte de Provence, which covers about 20,000 hectares and produces some 18 million cases of rosé annually, 2 million of which comes, to the United States alone. There's a plethora of grapes grown here to make rosé, but including white grapes, but Grenache, Cinsault, and Mourvedre are the grapes that dominate rosé production, okay? Co-fermentation is allowed, saignée is allowed, but direct press has really kind of become the method of choice in this particular area, which can be seen as so many of the wines are very, very pale in color. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2020, there are now 5 subregions that you can find or will soon be found on a bottle of Provence rosé. So again, Provence being such a large area with many different growing areas, breaking this down into subregions is really important when it comes to selling a more premium price point, because you want to be able to definitively say which area it actually comes from. And there's still going to be a lot of blended rosés, but when the subregion shows up on the label, expect to spend a little bit more. And then Côte de Provence also has a cruise system that was put into place in 1955. I think there are 30 some producers that banded together to create a cruise system, and it's kind of a combination of a organizational system and cruise system that was put together of the best producers to kind of highlight, this is what really high quality rosé could be. And of those crus, we have 3 of them in our portfolio: Clos Cibon, Clos Mariel, and Chateau de Sel, with the last 2 coming from the Domaine Atz property, okay? But typically your Côte de Provence are going to be really crisp and fresh on the palate, with a lot of floral garrigue kind of characteristics in them. And then there's Bandol, which is the smallest area and right along the coastal area. It's a natural amphitheater. It's about 1,600 hectares. It's got all south-facing slopes, maximizing your sunlight. You got about 3,000 sunlight hours, but its slope and its south-facing slope really maximizes the amount of sunlight that you could possibly get there. So 3,000 hours on a slope versus 3,000 hours on flat land, you're getting a lot more photosynthesis effect on that slope. There's mixed soils here, but the limestone and gravel run throughout most of it, and Mourvedre is the primary grape here. So although Bandol is known for making really high quality red wines, it also makes some phenomenal rosé. In fact, rosé is about 30% of its production, and these rosés, they're dense and concentrated, and most Bandols really benefit from decanting to really help aerate that Mourvedre, to really bring out the aromatic complexities of Mourvedre. And then I also mentioned here very quickly that, Côte d'Aix-en-Provence, very cool city to go visit as well. It's the warmest and driest in Provence. And because, again, the fact that it is so dry, there's more organic vineyards being planted in this area. In fact, 100% of the vineyards in Aix-en-Provence are organic. So you may not see it on the label, but any Provence in our portfolio that comes and states Aix-en-Provence is organic, because all the vineyards are already organic. Okay, so Aix-en-Provence rosés are different from Côte de Provence, as they produce bigger, fruitier, more friendly styles of wine. And then this brings us to Languedoc-Roussillon. This is a region that actually accounts for 30% of France's organic vineyards, and it's also France's leading producer of rosé. They produce over 40 million cases of rosé, and it's about 34% of all of France's rosé production comes out of Languedoc-Roussillon. The climate here is slightly warmer than that of Provence, but it's still Mediterranean. It's not that warm. It's still, that Mediterranean climate, just warmer than Provence. The Roussillon area, which we'll see on the next slide, is actually, it's closer to the Pyrenees and it's closer to the Atlantic Ocean. And so the warm Mediterranean actually acts as a vacuum that sucks the cold Atlantic air across the base of the Pyrenees and into the Languedoc, into the Roussillon area. So Roussillon is actually distinctively cooler than the rest of the Languedoc area. Okay, again, a wide variety of soils down here, but limestone, schist, and gravel are what dominate. And so Languedoc AOC is the former Coteaux de Languedoc. So if you go on, and you Google Languedoc, you might find Coteaux de Languedoc, and you're trying to understand the difference between Languedoc AOC and the Coteaux de Languedoc AOC. Well, basically in 2007, Coteaux de Languedoc ceases to exist, and Languedoc is what is now the official name, but I still see Coteaux de Languedoc listed quite often. All right. And basically what makes this unique is it's not a continuous region. It's actually a bunch of anything that's in the Languedoc that has its own appellation that you see on this map here can actually be blended into what is called the Languedoc AOC. So it's a big declassification zone for a lot of places, but it is not a continual zone. It can only be made up of the official AOCs, can be blended into something called Languedoc AOC. And it's really defined by rosé production, and rosés with Languedoc AOC must be at least 50% Grenache. So you know that if you're drinking a Languedoc rosé, it is definitely driven by Grenache. And then they use, direct press Saignée and cold maceration are all being used down in this particular area, usually in combinations. So one of the areas within the Languedoc is Cabrières, not Corbières. So Corbières is a very large area. It's Cabrières, which is located up in this area, is a separate AOC. It's really off the beaten path, okay? It's a large area. Right now, there's only 5 producers and 300 hectares that are actually planted. And the Tramontane wind blows in this area year round, allowing really for them to be able to grow organic and biodynamic much easier because you don't have the humidity to deal with. Yeah, this is where Gerard Bertrand's temple is located, and we're going to talk about that here shortly. But pretty much, there are 5 producers, 300 acres, and they're all basically grown organically. All right. So rosé is the primary production. Again, about 50% of the wine that comes out of Cabrières is rosé. They grow a lot of grapes, but Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, Cinsault are the ones that actually dominate. Okay. So I think this is a really important part of talking about rosé, is the upsell opportunity, because people are willing to spend. Rosé is understood now, and the upsell option should be available on all wine lists and in every retail store shelf. And these are 3 wines you can talk about. They're certainly priced higher, and these are wines that definitely get better after you open and decant them. They're also wines that don't have to be drunk within a year of release. I've had a number of these wines with 2, 3, 4 years in the bottle, and they're absolutely beautiful. Okay, so the rules that we've kind of put down on rosé, that they have to be drunk within a year of the vintage, doesn't really apply to wines of this caliber. So from Desclans, we have Rock Angel, and I know for selling to the Psalms and the geeks out there, Whispering Angel can be a really tough sell because it's everywhere, but Rock Angel is not. And when you taste the 2 side by side, the Rock Angel is by far a superior wine, and it's marginally priced higher. Okay, but it's basically all old vine production. It's aged in large oak cask. It's made from direct press. The vines, a lot of the vines are 90-plus-year-old Grenache vines. I was actually there and saw this vineyard is absolutely beautiful, where Rock Angel is coming from. It's like its own little enclave of vineyards and all of these old vines that are just kind of got lost back there, right? So there's old Vermentino vines that are actually interplanted with them, and basically it's all harvested together, co-fermented, and then aged in 600-liter barrels, as well as steel. So it's in both barrels and steel, right? And then they use about 5% of the press juice that has been fermented, because they settle it. They ferment the press juice separately, and then they add about 3 to 5 to maybe 6% of the press juice back in. And this, to me, is one of the most important things that define Rock Angel, and that there's so much density of depth of flavor in this wine. It's really fantastic rosé, right? And then from Domaine At, from Bandol, we have Chateau Ramassen. And this is also direct press, but it's dominated by Mourvedre as opposed to Grenache. So the Mourvedre is the primary grape variety. Here it's about 60 to 70% Mourvedre. Again, all old vines. Everything is organically farmed. It comes from one specific estate. All the fruit is hand-picked and hand-sorted. And then each single plot or lot is direct pressed, fermented separately, and then we'll age them in large neutral casks for about 8 months, and then they make their final blend. Okay, and this is a rosé with great depth of flavor, and really when it first comes out of the bottle, it's kind of tight and hard, and then again, once it gets some aeration into it, it's like, wow, this wine just blossoms and just opens up, and the mouth goes from this tightly wound ball into this big balloon, right? Which really, and then it's got all the really distinct savory characteristics of Mourvedre that make it very different from Rock Angel. And then we have Bertrand, Clos de Temple, and highly recommend that people to make the trek, if you're in the area, to go out to see Clos Temple. This is a very, very special place. I mean, it is like a sanctuary for Gerard Bertrand, and it is it is all biodynamic fruit. The vines are 50 to 60 years old, and when you walk on the property, you immediately feel the change of energy in this area. Everything is hand-picked, it's cold pressed and settled. This wine is going to be aged on the lees. It's got 6 months in French oak, it's all picked and fermented and blended on fruit day. So it really follows the whole biodynamic calendar as far as how it's planted, how it's grown, when it's picked, when it's blended, and when it's bottled, all follow the biodynamic calendar. It is a pricey rosé, but it does come in 3 packs, talking about $100 a bottle. And drinking Clos Temple early, sometimes people say, I don't get the wine because the oak can be a little bit more obtuse early on. But once you get an extra year in the bottle, this wine really begins to gel, and it's just an amazing bottle of wine and really well worth the extra money. I mean, if every place needs the top end rosé or the top end wine from that particular area, and this is Gerard Bertrand really defining where quality can go with rosé with this particular wine. So those are the 3 wines I would recommend for our upsell. Sean, anything you want to add?
I recently tasted that Salon Rock Angel, and I agree with you. I was shocked of the intensity and the depth of minerality that was coming out of this bottle. Most of us are fairly familiar with the Domaine Haute, the Clos Temple from Bertrand. It is it's a different style. You can taste the new oak, but it is every bit as balanced as any rosé I've ever tasted. It is not heavy-handed. It is, I don't want to say it's poetic, but it's very, very expressive. Huge amounts of different types of red fruits. It's a really fantastic bottle. So I know when I first saw it, I said, this is just a marketing thing, but absolutely not. This is an extremely high quality bottle. So we will be tasting the 3 of these on the June 8th event. So if this is something that interests you and you have accounts that could toy with this, please have them invited and register through the portal. Also, I want to say, Matt, thank you for putting this together. So much information to take in 1 hour is pretty hard to do. So I'd encourage everybody to use these SharePoint portals to go back and take a few notes. Everything that Matt puts together and we try to press is that we're always defending the price of the wines. We're defining the quality that got us to that price. And there's so much to research in a bottle of rosé to help people understand the premium price, why they should be capturing some of this market share. The $9 rosé is easy to sell these days, but I think the folks are really asking for a higher tier, and they're willing to buy a bottle of it for the table. They don't need to buy the glass. They can spend the $60, $70 to get a really nice bottle of rosé on the table. One last point, if you are going to go out and taste Clos Temple, Haute, or Rock Angel, today is not a fruit day on the biodynamic calendar. So maybe wait till Thursday or Friday to pop those bottles.
Yeah, yes. Very good. Great point, Sean. And actually, if you don't have the biodynamic calendar on your iPhone or Android or whatever phone you might be using, download that app. You will be surprised. Don't look at the app until after you start tasting wine. I can't tell you how many times I've tasted wines multiple days in a row. I'm like, it doesn't taste right today. And I open up the app and what is it? It's a root day. It's really quite amazing how the biodynamic calendar is more than just, it's more than just hocus pocus. It's really very serious stuff. So with that, we're a minute over, so we want to wrap this up for everyone. We appreciate all of your time, and hopefully this gave you a lot of information on rosé to go out and sell a greater variety and higher price points as well, and help your customers understand why they should be spending a little bit more money on rosé as well. Thank you all. Thank you, Sean, for the great input.